Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with the next update for my Big Fat Eyeshadow project. This is a project that I created this year to try to get a better idea of my collection and see how I liked my palettes as standalones. So before, I have done a lot of different project pans. I use panel eyeshadows, I do panel palettes, I do black deco panning, I've done other eyeshadow projects in the past. I have a lot of projects where I focus on eyeshadows. Project Level Up is also one, by the way. There's also a project that I created, which I also do, which is eyeshadow focused. But I felt like I didn't really do like just looks with the palettes without kind of considering what I'm panning a lot. So I wanted to make a project this year where I do focus more on using my palettes as a whole and just creating whatever looks I want. So in this project, I have 4 palettes at any point in time. If I do have a Project Level Up palette that I haven't used already, that is going to be one of the palettes. Otherwise, the other 3 are hand selected. This month I do have 4 palettes just because my Project Level Up palette is one that I already have used. And I'm also going to introduce 4 new palettes as well. And with those 4 palettes, I have to make 3 exclusive looks with those palettes, and I can do whatever I want for those looks, but it has to be exclusively using those palettes. That's kind of the main idea of the project. When I have used them, I go ahead and I rank them, and I have 4 different categories, so they can score anywhere between, obviously, like 0 to 20 points. So that's, again, the main gist of the project. Apart from the palette theme in this project, I also have 2 other parts, which is my eyeshadow bank, which was inspired by Laura Force. She also has an eyeshadow bank where she can earn points, and that way she can buy eyeshadows. I am on a no buy otherwise for eyeshadows unless I get points in to spend. I will talk about that in a bit more details when I get to the section of the video. And then also I have my Expand Those pans, which was inspired by Dora. I will also have her link down below. And with that, I am selecting eyeshadows with pan from the palettes that I have chosen for the month. And I need to use those specific eyeshadows 5 times. So that is all of the introduction, all of the housekeeping. I'm going to jump into the video, but before I do so, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. So I'm going to start off with the eyeshadow bank. So I'm going to talk you through all of the points that I've earned in the past month and if I did bring anything in. So the ways I can earn points is through a few different categories. I have No Pan Left Behind earns me 1 point, but only the first time, of course, I use the palette No Pan Left Behind for the year. I also have 10 uses, so every time I use an eyeshadow 10 times, I get 1 point. We have 100 uses, and if I hit that threshold, I get 5 points, which is basically half an eyeshadow, but I'll talk you again through that in a second. I have pans, which also gives me 1 point. And then lastly, we have finished eyeshadows, which also gives me 5 points per finished eyeshadow. And with those points, I have to earn 10 points in order to buy 1 eyeshadow. I'm currently digging myself out of the negatives because I do have a rule that I can go into the negatives if I get a gift or a PR or anything like that. It's something that I buy myself, I can't go in the negative for, but currently I am in the negative because I have gotten some gifts this year. I actually haven't purchased anything on my own accord yet this year. I've only been gifted things, which is absolutely fine by me. It means that this no buy is working. So I'll let you know where I am with my points today. I'm going to start off with the points that I've earned first. So for No Pan Left Behind, I have 4 palettes that I achieved No Pan Left Behind on, and those are the Natasha Nona Sunrise, which is in this project at the moment, the Cleona Deep Sea Treasures palette, which was in my deco panning. We have the Natasha Nona Gold and the Amrisi palette from Anastasia. Again, both in this project. So those are 4 points right there. Then for 10 uses, we have quite a few points here. I managed to get 17 points from this section. So first up, we have my Burberry eyeshadow in Rosewood, which is in my yellow brick pan. I use that one every single day in my eyebrows, so I got a lot of use out of that one. I managed to get 30 uses on that, so 3 points this past month, and I have used that one 210 times so far this year. We have 2 Cleona eyeshadows next. We have the shade Renaissance and Queen's Banquet, and I used both of those 10 times each for 2 points altogether, and both of them I only used 10 times so far this year. I also have a couple shades from my Panda palette, which is the Soft Glam palette. The first one out of those is the shade Rustic, which I have used 10 times in the past month for a total of 30. I have a couple more that I'll get back to in a second, but we have a few more other shades in between. We have 2 shades from my Beauty Bay Love Nose palette, which is my Project Level Up palette at the moment. And I used the shade Cotton 10 times, as well as Chandelier, also 10 times. So 2 points there. We have another shade that I used in my year-long project pan, which is the Huda Beauty Gold Obsessions palette, and I used the second shade there 20 times in the past month for a total of 30 this year. We have the shade Amaze from Colourpop. It's one of the Super Shock shadows, which I also used 10 times in the past month for a total of 30, and that is also in my year-long rolling project pan. Like I mentioned, we do have a couple more shades from my palette. We have the shade Fairy, which I used 10 times for a total of 20. As well as the shade Mulberry, also 10 times for a total of 30. We also have the shade Dusty Rose, which I have used 10 times for a total of 30. And lastly, from my Soft Glam palette, we have the shade Sienna, which I have used 10 times for a total of 40. So those are those shades. The last couple of shades that we have are one from my Pretty Level Up palette again. We have the shade Confetti, which I have used 10 times. And I believe, yeah, the last shade for the whole month and that I have reached a 10 use threshold for is the shade Metallic Peach from Stila, which is currently in my deck of panning, and I've used that 10 times in the past month for a total of 30. So those are all the points that I earned that way, and again that totals to 17. For my 100 uses, I did actually manage to get that threshold this past month, which is amazing, and that is my Burberry Rosewood eyeshadow. This is actually the only shadow, actually no, that's not. I go for the Tempera eyeshadow from my Soft Glam palette, but the Rosewood eyeshadow from Burberry, this is the second time I'm reaching 100 uses. I have 200 uses on its total now, but obviously I will only reach that 100 threshold, so that is kind of what's counting, and that's 5 more points. So we do have pans as well, and I managed to get 7 points from pans. I had pan my 7 eyeshadows in the past month. We have the Odenside Merry Christmas palette in the shade Elf Wish, which was my Product Level Up Level 4 palette. We also have 2 shades from my Anastasia Soft Glam palette. We have the shade Rustic as well as the shade Dusty Rose. I had pan on both of those as well last month, so that's 2 more pans there. I also have a shade from my Odin's Eye Red Dragon palette in the shade Amber, which was in my pan of eyeshadows, and I pan on that shade. And then the remaining 3 shades come from my current Product Level Up palette, which is a little bit of a spoiler there. But we have the shade Chandelier, the shade Candlestick, and the shade Confetti, which are the last pans that I hit in the month of July. The last way I can earn points is through finished eyeshadow, and I'm happy to say that I do have an eyeshadow empty. If you watch my Rolling Project pan, you've already seen it, but that is the second shade from that Huda Beauty Gold Obsessions palette, and I was able to completely finish that in those 30 uses that I mentioned earlier, and so that is 5 additional points there. So I'm really, really happy with all the points that I earned in the past month. If I total all of that together, that is 38 points in the month of July. And looking at where I was last month, I was standing at minus 148 points. So I was negative almost 150. And with those 38 uses added on top, I'm now standing at minus 110, which corresponds to 11 eyeshadows if I do that 10 points per eyeshadow. So definitely still in the negative, and it's going to take me quite a few more months to get out of the negative, but I'm happy that I was able to get quite a few points in the past month. Like 38 points is almost equal to 4 eyeshadows. So really happy with that, and that is where I'm standing with my beauty budget today. So the next section we're going to talk about is, of course, the palettes, and I have my 4 palettes right here. I've been working on the Through My Eyes palette from Colourpop. We worked on the Amrezy palette from Anastasia. We have 2 Anastasia Nona palettes. We have the Gold palette and the Sunrise palette. So those are the 4 palettes that I was working on in the past month. And the first palette that I have to talk about for the free looks is the Sunrise palette. This is going to be the first palette that I'm going to talk about. So let's jump into that one first. This palette, I'm going to insert some footage of the swatches and stuff so you can look at that here. But it's a beautiful kind of sunset, sunrise kind of color story. It's really rich. Colorful, it has some beautiful oranges, yellow tones, reds, maroons, and super, super nice. It also has some more neutral shades, which is really nice because it means that this palette is quite versatile, but I'll cover all of that in the scoring section later on. So let's jump into the first look with this palette, and that is this look right here. I started off with the shade Glory on my outer corner and Direct Crease, because I wanted to make a bit of a sunset kind of look here, or like, you know, using more of those rich tones on the left side of the palette. Then I took the shade Cornelian as my first blend shade, which is a beautiful orangey kind of shade, and then the shade Citrine as my second blend, which is a bit of a lighter, more yellow tone shade. I did then cut my crease, and I put the shade Awakening all over my lid, and that was my main lid shade. I then move on to my lower lash line, where I put the shade Jasper on my lower lash line and then blended that out with the shade Morning. The last shade that I used for this specific look is the shade Laurel as my inner corner highlight, which is just a beautiful kind of inner corner highlight shade, and that was the first look complete. For day 2, I wanted to do a bit more of a simple look. I wanted to do more of a neutral kind of look, so I did this one right here. I started off with the shade Morgan in my crease as well as on my lower lash line. And then for my lid shade, I took the shade Azalea all over the lid, which is a beautiful kind of pink to bronze kind of duochrome. I then ended up taking the shade Agate on my very inner lid, and then again I put the shade Laurel on my inner corner, and that was the second look. For my third look, I wanted to make something a bit different again, and I wanted to do more of a smokier, kind of colorful look with the red tones in the palette. So I started off with the shade Glory on my crease, which is that kind of maroon shade. And then to deepen it up a little bit more in the outer corner, I took the shade Clove. For my lid shades, I ended up taking the shade Poppy on my outer lid as well as on my lower lash line. And then for my center lid, I went in with the shade Phlox, which is quite similar to Poppy. It's just a little bit more kind of orangey red rather than more kind of maroon red. To lighten it up a little bit on my inner lid, I took the shade Aster as just like the very inner lid shade. And then again for my inner corner, I took the shade Laurel, and that was the final look. So those were all of the looks that I made with this palette right here. Let's go through the uses for this palette as well, what I used. I used most of the shades once, so I'm not going to cover that. Like I said, I did complete no plan left behind on this one. But the ones that I used more than once was the shade Laurel. I used that one 3 times. I used the shade Glory right here twice. Then the shade Morgan right here also twice. And then the rest of the shades in the palette I used once. So those were all of the looks. Let's go through the ratings next. So for color story, I gave this one a 5. I said I really love this color story. It's a warm sunset type of palette, but it's still more unique with the undertones, the pops of purpley shades, and the richness of the shadows. It goes light and deep, and it's honestly just a really well thought out palette, so 5 there. For versatility, I gave it a 3. I said that this palette has a lot of variety despite being quite a warm tone palette. There's options to make smokier looks, light, airy, everyday looks, colorful looks, and more neutral looks, which you saw a little bit of a kind of example of in my 3 looks. And you can obviously do way more than that, but that's the 3 looks that I decided on. I said, of course, they're gonna lean very warm tone, but within those tones, it is quite versatile, so 3 for versatility. For the quality, I said 3 again, and I said this is not Natasha Nona's best quality, however, it's still really good. The mattes blend super nicely, however, I do wish that some of them were her cream to powder mattes, because those are my favorite, and I feel like that would work really well with those kind of more bright tones. But I said that otherwise the mattes are not to fault. The shimmers aren't the most impactful, which is why I'm putting it as a 3. There are a few more sparkly shades, but overall a lot of them lean a little more subtle and like almost satiny. For personal ranking, I gave this palette a 4, and I said that this is not a favorite palette of mine, however, I do rate it very high. I love the richness of the warm tones in here, and I think it's such a beautiful color story, and it's probably one of my favorite warm tones palettes in my collection, so 4 there. And adding all of that up, that means that this palette ranked in at 14 out of 20 points. So those were the 3 looks for my Sunrise palette. We're going to move on to the second palette next, which is the Amrezy palette. So we're going to jump straight into looking what the palette looks like. It is a beautiful color story that has both like warm tones, but also a few more kind of rosier tones, especially when it comes to the shimmers. This one has a few kind of pops of colors, and it's just an overall really nice color story. I always was really drawn to this palette, just because these are tones that I really like. I will talk you more about my feelings, of course, with the ratings, but let's jump into the looks first. So for look number 1, we started off with the shade Semsa on my crease and outer corner, which is like a purpley pink kind of shade. And I wanted to give some contrast. So for my center lid, I went in with the shade Dragon, which is an orangey kind of gold shade. Really, really pretty. Then for the inner lid, I went in with the shade Anastasia, which is a beautiful kind of pink to gold duochrome, which I did really enjoy. And for my inner corner, I took the shade Wasted, which is more of a kind of satiny shade, or it's like almost like a matte with sparkles in it, but you can actually see the sparkles a little bit. So I put that in my inner corner as well as a blending out shade. So that was the shade Wasted. And then lastly, for the first look, I took the shade Reezy on my lower lash line. So that was the first look with this palette. I did really like that one, but let's move on to look number 2 next. So for look number 2, I wanted to make more of a neutral look, and I started off with the shade OG mixed with Semsa a little bit, again that kind of plummy purpley pink, and I mixed those into my crease because I wanted more of a pinkier toned crease shade. Then I ended up taking the shade Wasted again as my blending out shade. And for my lid, I took the shade Barb all over my lid as well as on my inner corner, which is that beautiful kind of sparkly shade you can see. I really, really love this shadow. And then to finish off the look, I ended up doing a little bit of a wing liner, and I used the shade 1988 for that. Then moving on to look number 3. This is quite an interesting one. I wanted to use the blue shade, but I had a vision of using this one with more kind of purpley and darker shades at the very end of the palette. So what I did is I went in with the shade BK, which is the black, as like a kind of liner smudged out into my crease to create like a V shape. And then I blended BK out with the shade Hugo, which is kind of like a brown, like a deep brown with a little bit of a purpley undertone. And then for my lid, I went in with a blue shade in the palette called Leo all over my lid. And I wanted that to be the main star of the show. To blend everything out and clean it up, I used the shade Wasted again as my blending out, cleaning up shade, which works really nicely. And then lastly for this look, I used the shade Barb again in my inner corner. So that was the third and final look with this palette. For the uses, I used quite a few of these shades more than once, but again, I did do no plan left behind on this one, so I'm only going to cover the ones that I used more than once. I didn't use all of these shades, by the way, in the look. Some of them I used afterwards, but I have completed no plan left behind on it. So overall, I have used the shade Wasted 3 times. The shade Barb I've used 5 times, and that is actually my Expand Those Pants shade. That means that I have hit my goal on this shadow right there. Then for this first row, the rest of the shades I have only used once. And then for the second row, I used Semsa twice. So actually, I haven't used that many shades more than once. I thought I used more of them more than once, but that is my usage for the Unweezy palette. So for the rating of this palette, I said for Color Story a 3. I said I love these rosy undertone shades, and I think it's a really fun color story with a few pops of colors. I was originally going to give this a 4, but I decided to remove 1 point as a few of the shades are too similar. There's also a few that are too dark for like what I like, and a few that I used to never use. So 3 points there. For versatility, I gave it a 5, and I said that I really have to give it to this palette. Every single look that I made with this palette was very much different from one another, and you can see that in my 3 looks. I feel like I was leaning towards giving it a 4, but I need to be honest in the sense of that the versatility is really there. Yes, there are a few shades missing for sure, but I have to dock a point for that under the color story rather than versatility, if that makes sense. So 5 points there. For quality, I gave it a 3. I said this palette has a good quality overall. It's a really lovely palette, however, it's not an outstanding quality, and the press glitters really are quite bad. Then we have the final rating, which is personal ranking, and I gave it a 4 here. I said I love this palette as its undertones is really something that I adore. I also have some nostalgia with this palette as the first palette that my boyfriend ever got me. However, there are some flaws to it, which is why I can't give it a 5. And it falls in under 4. And that means that this palette scores in at 15 points out of 20, which I'm really, really happy with. Okay, so 2 more palettes to go. Next up, we have my Nona Gold palette, which is a beautiful, beautiful palette. You can see it right here. This one is just a beautiful palette. I love this one so much, which I think a lot of you guys know. It's starting to look a bit more well loved in my collection too, which is something that I am so grateful for because it is really one of my favorite palettes. It just has a lot of variety to it and a lot of everyday type of shades for me. So that is what the palette looks like, and let's move into the looks. So we're going to start off with the first look right here, which is one where I wanted to go into more of the cool toned side of the palette. And I started off with the shade Aria in my crease as well as on my lower lash line. I decided to kind of deepen that up a little bit with the shade Teak just in my lower crease. And then to deepen up the outer corner even more, I took the shade Log and put that out there. For my lid shades, I took the shade Varus as my all over lid shade, which is more of a kind of taupier shade. I really like that one. But then to give it a little bit more extra sparkle, I went in with the shade Kava, which is more of the topper shade, all over my lid as a topper. Then lastly, for this look, I went in with my inner corner shade, and for that I decided to go with the Sparks, which is that kind of whitish shade in the palette. And that was the first look complete. So let's move swiftly into look number 2, and this is probably one of my favorite looks that I've made all month, and that is this one, as you can see right here. So I started off with the shade Python on my outer corner as well as my outer crease, which is the blue turquoisey matte in the palette. I took the shade Sandstone on my mid and inner crease. I didn't really touch that other half where I put that blue down, but I put that in my inner crease. Then for my lid shade, I took the shade Brass all over the lid, which is the bottom left hand corner shade. And then to wrap up the look, I did my lower lash line, and I took the shade Aurora on my outer and a lower lash line, blending into like Python in the outer corner. And then I took the shade Lime Chrome on the center of my lower lash line to give a bit more of that kind of bright grass green kind of pop. And then again for my inner corner, I used the shade Sparks, and that was the second look complete. For day 3, I wanted to do more of a yellowy toned look, but I didn't want to go too kind of yellow. I wanted to still stay within like those sandy undertones. So I started off with the shade Dijon, which is kind of like a mustardy, yellowy brown. Really stunning shade, and I put that in my crease as well as on my lower lash line. I then went in with the shade Aurum, which is the bottom right hand corner shade, and I put that on my outer corner as kind of like that shade. I wanted, like I had mainly shimmer shades in this look, but I wanted to put that one on my outer corner. Then for the center lid, for that pop of yellow, I took the shade Oro, which is that really bright gold in the center of the palette. And then for my inner lid, I took the shade Alchemist, which is right below that in the palette, to kind of bring back a bit more kind of bronziness rather than just bright yellowy gold. And that was it for the shimmers on the lid. And then again, to wrap up the look, I used the shade Sparks on my inner corner, which is the go-to kind of inner corner shade for me in this palette. So that was the final look with my Natasha Nona Gold palette. And again, I did complete no pan left behind on this palette. I actually only used every single shade once apart from Sparks, which I used 3 times, once in every look. And otherwise, I used to use every single shade in here once. So that is my gold palette complete. Okay, so let's go into the rankings for this palette next. It's going to rank quite high, guys, but I think most of you guys knew that. But let's start off with color story. I gave it a 5. I said, my goodness, is this a palette well thought out? It might look like a boring, warm, neutral palette with a pop of blue at first glance, but there's so much more to it. The undertones of the mattes are so unique. The shimmers all have different undertones and interest to them, and everything pairs so nicely together, and it's just such a well thought out palette. So that is the color story, 5 there. For versatility, I did give it a 4. I said, despite this palette looking quite boring at first glance, there is so much you can do. You can do extremely warm gold looks. You can do more cool toned neutral / taupe looks. You can do more subtle looks, sparkly looks, bright colorful looks, and so much more. Yes, all shades kind of lean gold, green, or turquoise in some way, but there is also more kind of neutral undertones as well. So that's kind of why I'm giving it a 4, even though it's not like the most kind of, out there palette. It's not like lots of colorful shades, but for what it is just really versatile, and yeah, 4 for that. For quality, I gave it a 5. I said this palette is the best of the best. Everything about it is high quality. There's not a dud shade in this palette, and it's always a joy to use. I said this is 100% the palette in my collection with the best quality. So, of course, it was going to rank 5 there. For personal ranking, I gave this one a 5. I said, just judging from all my previous comments, this rating shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. I love this palette, and I have always said that this is my favorite palette in my collection, and I still stand by that. Yes, there's other palettes that kind of are up there, but this palette has never faltered, and I'm just so happy that I have it in my collection. So 5 for that ranking, and summing all of that up, this one comes in at 19 out of 20 points, which actually makes this one like a tie for my highest ranking palettes with 2 others. So that is kind of where my gold palette comes in. So let's move on to the final palette, which is the Through My Eyes palette from Colourpop. And this is the one that I've used most recently. And this is a really fun color story. I feel like this has always been one that I felt was underrated from Colourpop, because it's just such a interesting color story, I feel like, and it's very different from a lot of other things they do, and the quality is also really high. I'm of course going to talk more about that later on, but I always just thought this was an underrated palette from Colourpop, and it's one that stuck around for a long time despite me decluttering majority of my Colourpop palettes over the years. So as you can see, also this one is very well loved because it has a lot of pans showing, and of course you will see what it looks like after my week of use in a second, but yeah, that is what the palette looks like. And I'm going to jump into the looks first. So for day number 1, I wanted to do more of a neutral look, and I did this one right here. So I took the shade Canela on my crease and out the corner, And then I moved on to the shade Sandalwood to blend all of that out. So I put that in my crease as well as a blending out shade. Then for my lid shade, I went in with the shade Muse all over my lid. So that was the main shade that I wanted to use in this look. And then for my inner corner, as well as kind of packed into my inner lid, I used the shade Lucido, which is the first shade in the palette. And that was look number 1. It's a very simple look, but I wanted to do something like that as well, because I think I was going out to do something that day and I didn't want to do anything too crazy. Then for day number 2, I definitely did a bit more of an out there look, and that is this one right here. So I took the shade Divina and I put that in my outer corner, which is the deepest shade in the palette. And I started to blend that out and put into my outer crease the shade Misbehave, which is the last shade in the palette. I also took further blend that all out. I took the shade Nostalgia, used to create a really nice fade at the outer corner. Then I decided to go into the green part of the eye look, and I took the shade Moody and I kind of blended that into my inner crease, which to create like the base of the green look. And then moving on to shimmers, I took the shade Nocturne for my more mauve toned shimmer on the outer corner, and the shade Emerald Dream as my green shimmer on the inner kind of half of my lid. Then for my inner corner as well as on my inner crease, I took the shade kind of up into my inner crease to make it a little bit brighter and to brighten the look up. And then lastly for this look, I took the shade Flex on my outer kind of lower lash line, and that was the second look complete. For the third and final look, we actually have the look that I'm wearing today, so I'm going to scooch a little bit closer so you can see what it looks like. But I started off with the shade Lomo, which is the kind of red tone in the palette, on my outer corner. And then I took the shade Euphoric on my crease and lower lash line, so like both down here as well in blending out in my crease. And then to blend it out even more, in the upper crease, I took the shade Wild Soul, which is the yellow in the palette. And then to help everything blend really well, I took the shade In a Wink on my brow bone just to blend everything down a little bit. For my lid shade, all over my lid I have the shade Mesmerize, which is that kind of bronzy shade. And then lastly for this look, I have the shade Lucido again on my inner corner, and that is this final look for this palette. And again, as you can see with this palette, I have a lot of pans. I did actually end up having an expand those pans in here, and the one that I randomly rolled in was the shade Euphoric, which I have used. I'm actually 1 use shy of it. I have used it 4 times. However, I am going to use it next week. I have a look plan, which is shadow, which I'm going to use a lot of the shadow for. It will be up. It should be this one. I'm going to use this one with the blue. Actually, the blue that I have on my nails right now. So you can expect that in a couple of videos coming up. But yeah, I have 1 use shy, but I'm going to use that. I'm going to get that used up before I put this palette away. Otherwise, I'm going to let you know how many times I used each shade. So I used this shade here 3 times, I used the rest of the top mode once, I used it once, 4 times, and then once. Then this whole row, actually the rest of the shades, both this row and this row I have used once. The majority of the palette I have used the once, and as you can also tell, I have completely no plan left behind on this palette now, but I did actually do it now in the beginning of August. So this one will be counted into my beauty budget on my eyeshadow bank in August instead. But that is this palette right here. For the rankings, I started off with Color Story. I gave it a 3. I said this is a really fun color story, and I've kept it around for a long time, despite getting rid of majority of my Colourpop palettes. It isn't my absolute favorite anymore, but I do think it's a good one, so 3 points there. For versatility, I gave it a 4, and I said there's a lot of versatility in this palette. You can do a lot of colorful looks like green, red, orange, sunset, purpley mauve, etc. But there's also a few more neutral options, both warmer toned and a few cooler shades. So 4 there. For quality, I gave it a 3. I said that this palette is pretty good for Colourpop. Some of the shimmers are actually really sparkly and pretty, and the mattes are okay. It's definitely not a favorite, but it's an okay palette, so I gave it a 3 there. For personal ranking, I gave this one a 2. I said I used to love this palette, but now I feel a bit meh about it. Some of the looks I made I really liked, including this one. Some I didn't, and honestly, I feel that I could easily live without this palette now, and I might depot some of the shades, but I'm kind of over the color story as a whole, so 2 points there. And adding all of that up, this palette scored in at 12 out of 20 points. And that is the last palette from this past month. So the last thing to do in this video, before we wrap up, is to introduce you to the 4 new palettes rolling into August. So the 4 palettes I'm going to use in August is, first up, my Norvina palette. This is a really beautiful color story. I wasn't really sure what time of year to put this palette in, so I'm putting it in here. It's kind of like the last palette that I chucked in this month when I don't have my Product Level Up palette to kind of work on. So yeah, this one is a really beautiful one. I absolutely love this palette, so that is going to be palette number 1. Then we have the Club Nebula palette from Kaleidos. This is a really, really beautiful palette. It has a lot of kind of colorful shades, but it's just a really unique color story. It has like deeper shades, but they're still colorful. It has some really vibrant shades, some more neutral shades, and a lot of beautiful sparkly shimmers. So I'm excited to reach for this one too. The third palette I'm going to introduce is one of my Pat McGrath palettes. I am so excited about this one because it's one of my favorite. This is the Utopian Dreams palette, which is like this. It's a really, really stunning. It's my first Pat McGrath palette that I ever got. I got it from my boyfriend for my birthday. So I love this palette a lot. And this is right up my alley with like the sparkly shades, the undertones, just like everything about this palette I absolutely love. So I can't wait to reach for this one and make 3 exclusive looks with it. So that is going to be palette number 3. Then the final palette that I'm going to work on in the month of August is this one right here, which is my Natasha Nona bronze palette. It's one that I absolutely adore again. It's such a beautiful palette. It has a lot of rich, warm tones. So it's like, yeah, it's just very much like summer into autumn palette for me, which is why I think August is going to be the perfect month for this palette. I know this is kind of repetitive and it has a lot of mixed reviews, but I personally love this one. So again, it's one that I'm really, really excited to reach for. This is honestly going to be a really, really nice month because all of the palettes that I'm rolling in are like palettes that I absolutely love reaching for. So I'm super excited to reach for these 4. I think I'm looking forward to all of these 4 palettes for different reasons because I know that I adore them. So before I wrap up this video, I'm just going to roll in the 2 pans that I have for Expandos pans because I have 2 palettes with pans previously. The first one is this one right here, which is the Norvina palette. I currently have 10 pans in this palette. So I'm going to go ahead and roll between 1 and 10 and let's see what I get. 10. Okay, not the eyeshadow that I'm most excited about. I might actually re-roll because this one is the shade Passion, which is a beautiful shade. I really love this one, but it's quite similar to a lot of things that I'm panning in my Pan palette, which is a soft glam palette. So I'm actually going to go ahead and re-roll because I think it's too similar to other things. Okay, 9, it's another matte, but that's fine. I think this one is going to be more different. So I'm going to roll in this shade right here, which is called Volatile. Probably one of the shades that I was least excited about, apart from Passion. But the kind of randomization guys have spoken. And I'm going to stick with Volatile because even though it's not like the most exciting shade, I think it's going to be good. It's also like one of the smallest pans in here, so it'll be fine. I'm going to roll in Volatile for 5 uses. And the second palette with pans is my Club Nebula palette, which I have 5 pans in. So we're going to go ahead and pick between 1 and 5 and see what I get for my Expandos pans. I'm just going to go and randomize and we get 3. Okay, yay. This is better because 3 is actually one of my favorite shades. And we have 1, 2, 3. So that is this shade here in the bottom corner, which is called Celestial. It's like a pink to gold duochrome. I really love these type of shades, so it's going to be nice to reach for this one. So that's going to be the one I'm rolling in from this palette for 5 uses. And with that, you guys, I'm going to wrap up this video here. I've been filming. I have 45 minutes worth of audio footage. So I've been filming for a long time. I'm going to wrap it up here. I hope you guys are having an amazing day wherever you are, and I will catch you in my next one. Bye, guys.